On November 18, 1978, in a remote jungle settlement in Guyana, over 900 people died in a single day, men, women, and even children, poisoned by cyanide-laced drinks. But this was not a mass murder orchestrated by some brutal dictator, it was something far more chilling, they willingly drank it. This was Jonestown, the deadliest cult massacre in modern history. A man named Jim Jones, using nothing but words, convinced over 900 intelligent, capable people to take their own lives. And the question we must ask is, how does this happen? How do seemingly rational people become so blind, so obedient that they willingly walk toward their own destruction? We like to think that intelligence protects us from foolishness, that if someone is educated, rational, and aware, they could never fall into such a trap. But history tells us otherwise. Again and again, we see stupidity, not evil, shaping the most catastrophic events in human history. Stupidity is more dangerous than evil. This is exactly what a German theologian and resistance fighter Dietrich Bonhoeffer realized during one of the darkest times in human history, Nazi Germany. While most people blamed evil for the horrors of the 20th century, Bonhoeffer made a terrifying observation. Stupidity is a more dangerous enemy of the good than evil. Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But why? How can stupidity be more dangerous than pure evil? The answer is more disturbing than you think. Throughout history, we have been taught to fear evil. We believe that the greatest dangers to society come from those who act with malice, those who deliberately seek to cause harm. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer saw something far more insidious, something even more dangerous than evil itself. According to Bonhoeffer, evil can be confronted, debated, and reasoned with. It has an agenda, a purpose, and even a twisted form of logic. Evil people may do terrible things, but they are often aware of their actions. They make calculated decisions. They understand consequences. This means that, at least in theory, evil can be stopped. It can be fought against with intelligence, resistance, and moral strength. Stupidity, however, is an entirely different beast. It is immune to logic. It cannot be debated or reasoned with. It does not seek destruction with intent, but its very nature leads to destruction. A person acting out of stupidity is far more dangerous than a person acting out of malice, because while evil has limits, stupidity does not. It is boundless, self-sustaining, and worst of all, it thrives in society without resistance. One of the greatest misconceptions people have is equating ignorance with stupidity, but Bonhoeffer made an important distinction. Ignorance is simply a lack of knowledge. It means a person hasn't been exposed to certain facts or perspectives. And the key thing about ignorance, it can be fixed. An ignorant person, when given access to knowledge and truth, has the ability to learn and change. Stupidity, on the other hand, is far more dangerous. It is not just a lack of knowledge, but an active resistance to learning. A stupid person does not simply lack information, they reject it. They refuse to accept new facts even when those facts are undeniable. They ignore logic, dismiss reason, and cling to beliefs no matter how much evidence is presented to them. This is why stupidity is so dangerous, it feeds on itself. The more a person succumbs to stupidity, the harder it is for them to break free. They double down on their false beliefs, surrounding themselves with like-minded people who reinforce their ignorance. They reject any information that contradicts their worldview, labeling it as false or propaganda. Instead of seeking truth, they seek comfort in their existing opinions, making them completely unreachable by logic. This resistance to reason is not just an individual problem, it has shaped some of the greatest disasters in history. Time and time again, leaders have made catastrophic decisions not because they lacked intelligence, but because they refused to accept reality. Take, for example, the NASA Challenger disaster of 1986. The space shuttle was set to launch on a cold January morning despite multiple engineers warning that the O-rings, critical components of the shuttle, were not designed to function in low temperatures. The evidence was clear, the warnings were loud, but those in charge refused to listen. They dismissed the concerns, convinced that the launch must proceed as planned. The result? 73 seconds after liftoff, Challenger exploded mid-air, killing all 7 astronauts on board. It was not ignorance that caused this tragedy, the engineers knew the risks. It was stupidity, a refusal to acknowledge inconvenient truths, an unwillingness to change course in the face of undeniable facts. History is full of such examples. Political leaders have ignored intelligence reports, generals have marched into unwinnable wars, corporations have dismissed expert warnings, all because of arrogance, overconfidence, and a refusal to admit they were wrong. Bonhoeffer also recognized another terrifying aspect of stupidity: it is not merely an individual failing, it is a social disease. Stupidity flourishes in groups. It spreads like a virus, infecting people who might otherwise be rational thinkers. The larger the group, the less likely individuals are to think critically for themselves. This is why propaganda works. This is why mobs form. This is why history keeps repeating itself. When people become part of a collective, they begin outsourcing their thinking to the group. They stop questioning, stop analyzing, and simply go along with what the majority believes. And as Bonhoeffer pointed out, the moment someone stops thinking for themselves, they are no longer an individual, they have become a vessel for stupidity. This is why some of the most devastating events in history did not happen because of a handful of evil masterminds. They happened because large numbers of ordinary people refused to question authority, refused to think critically, and refused to take responsibility for their actions. Why stupidity cannot be reasoned with. Perhaps the most disturbing part of Bonhoeffer's theory is this: stupidity is resistant to correction. If someone is stupid, no amount of evidence, no amount of reasoning, no amount of debate will change their mind. They do not lack information, they reject it. This is why fighting stupidity is so difficult. You cannot argue with a person who refuses to acknowledge reality. You cannot convince someone who has chosen ignorance over truth. And that is what makes stupidity, in Bonhoeffer's view, the greatest threat to society: not war, not crime, not even organized evil, but stupidity. The silent, invisible force that drives nations into ruin, that allows propaganda to spread unchecked, that turns ordinary people into instruments of destruction. It is a force that we cannot afford to ignore, because unlike evil, stupidity doesn't need a plan, an agenda, or even a motive. It simply exists, and that is enough to destroy everything in its path. We often think of stupidity as an individual flaw, something that exists in people who lack intelligence or wisdom. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer saw it differently. He believed that stupidity is not just an individual weakness, but a collective force. One that spreads like a virus, infecting entire societies. A single foolish person can make poor decisions, but when stupidity becomes widespread, when it is reinforced by social pressure, blind obedience, and propaganda, it transforms into something far more dangerous. It becomes a social disease capable of shaping the fate of entire nations. Stupidity does not exist in isolation, it thrives in groups. The moment people stop thinking for themselves and start relying on the collective, they become vulnerable to its influence. This is why stupidity spreads so easily. It is contagious, passed from person to person until it dominates an entire society. Bonhoeffer argued that when people are placed in large groups, they surrender their individual thinking. They stop questioning. They stop analyzing. They follow the crowd, assuming that if everyone else believes something, it must be true. This is the foundation of groupthink, a psychological phenomenon where people conform to the dominant belief even when that belief is clearly wrong. And once groupthink takes hold, stupidity spreads rapidly, creating a feedback loop of ignorance. One person's foolishness is reinforced by another's until questioning the group becomes impossible. This is how blind obedience is born, and it is through blind obedience that history's greatest horrors have unfolded. Dictators and authoritarian leaders have always understood one thing: stupidity is a weapon. They know that an intelligent, critically thinking society is difficult to control. But a society that does not question, a society that blindly obeys, that is the dictator's greatest ally. Adolf Hitler did not need an entire country of evil people to carry out the horrors of Nazi Germany. He only needed a population that was too blind, too obedient, and too unwilling to think for themselves. The Nazi regime thrived not because the German people were naturally cruel, but because propaganda turned them into unthinking followers. The Nazis used mass rallies, emotional speeches, and manipulated media to reinforce one simple message: do not question, do not think, just follow. And millions of people did exactly that. Even those who had doubts were afraid to go against the majority. They feared being outcasts. They feared punishment. And so they stayed silent, allowing evil to spread not through force, but through the passive compliance of an unthinking society. This is why Bonhoeffer saw stupidity as a greater threat than evil. Evil requires intent, but stupidity, it requires nothing but silence. To understand why people follow stupidity so easily, psychologists have studied how social pressure affects human behavior. Two of the most famous experiments reveal the terrifying truth: most people will obey authority and conform to the group, even when they know they are wrong. 1. The Milgram experiment: why people follow orders. In the 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted an experiment to test how far people would go in obeying authority. Participants were told they were part of a study on learning and were instructed to administer electric shocks to a person in another room whenever they answered a question incorrectly. What they didn't know was that the shocks were fake. The person in the other room was an actor. But the participants believed the shocks were real. They heard screams, pleas for mercy, even silence that suggested the person had passed out. And yet, most participants continued to press the button, delivering what they thought were lethal shocks, simply because a man in a lab coat told them to. Even when they were uncomfortable, even when they wanted to stop, they obeyed. This experiment proved that ordinary people will commit horrific acts not because they are evil, but because they are blindly following authority. And in a society where people are conditioned to obey without question, stupidity becomes a tool for oppression. 2. The Ask Conformity experiment: why people ignore the truth. Another psychologist, Solomon Asch, conducted an experiment that revealed something equally disturbing. Participants were placed in a room with actors pretending to be fellow participants. They were shown a series of lines and asked which line was the longest. The answer was obvious, but the actors, instructed by Asch, all gave the wrong answer on purpose. The real participant was the last to answer, and in over 75% of cases, the participant gave the wrong answer too, just because everyone else did. Even when they knew the truth, they chose to conform rather than stand out. This experiment showed how easily people abandon their own judgment in favor of the group. And once that happens, stupidity spreads uncontrollably. Stupidity is not just an inconvenience, it is a force that shapes history. It is the reason why authoritarian regimes rise. It is the reason why propaganda succeeds. It is the reason why false information spreads unchecked in the modern world. And the worst part? Stupidity thrives when no one fights against it. This is why Bonhoeffer believed it is our responsibility to resist stupidity wherever we see it. Because unlike evil, which can be confronted directly, stupidity can only be defeated by awakening people's ability to think for themselves. And if we fail to do that, then history will continue to repeat itself over and over again. Stupidity is often seen as a trait of the uninformed, the uneducated, or the weak. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer pointed out something far more disturbing: stupidity thrives in power. The more authority a person holds, the more likely they are to become blind to their own ignorance. We assume that powerful people, or world leaders, CEOs, high-ranking officials, must be intelligent. After all, how else did they rise to such heights? But history has proven again and again that power and intelligence do not always go hand in hand. In fact, power can create a feedback loop of ignorance, where the more powerful someone becomes, the less they are able to see their own stupidity. Why does this happen? Why do intelligent people, once they reach positions of power, often make catastrophically foolish decisions? The greatest danger of power is that it isolates people from reality. The higher someone climbs, the more removed they become from the consequences of their own actions. And the first thing power destroys is self-awareness. The yes men effect. People in power rarely hear the truth. They surround themselves with advisors, subordinates, and supporters who reinforce their views. These people, either out of fear or blind loyalty, tell them only what they want to hear. The result? A powerful person becomes trapped in an echo chamber of their own ignorance. The illusion of infallibility. Powerful individuals begin to believe that because they are in charge, they must be right. Their past successes convince them that their judgment is flawless, leading them to dismiss any warnings or criticism. The disconnection from reality. When you are powerful, you don't experience the consequences of your decisions the same way ordinary people do. If a CEO makes a bad decision, it's the employees who suffer. If a politician makes a disastrous policy choice, it's the public that pays the price. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Power breeds arrogance. Arrogance blinds people to their own stupidity. Stupidity leads to poor decisions. Poor decisions are covered up by those who depend on the leader, and the cycle continues. The result? Leaders who refuse to listen, refuse to adapt, and refuse to acknowledge their own mistakes until it's too late. History is full of examples of corporate leaders who, blinded by their own confidence, led their companies into disaster. Consider the 2008 financial crisis. Before the crash, multiple experts warned that the housing market was an unsustainable bubble. Economists pointed out the dangers of subprime mortgages. But the executives running the biggest banks ignored every warning. Why? Because they believed they were too powerful to fail. They convinced themselves that the market would keep growing forever, that their business models were flawless, and that the risks weren't real. They dismissed experts, silenced critics, and continued making reckless decisions until the entire global economy collapsed. It was not just greed that caused the crash, it was stupidity reinforced by power. Perhaps the most famous historical example of power-induced stupidity is the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986. The engineers working at the Chernobyl nuclear plant knew the risks of pushing the reactor beyond its limits. But the Soviet leadership, driven by arrogance and an obsession with proving their technological superiority, dismissed every concern. On the night of the disaster, when warnings began appearing on the control panels, the plant supervisors refused to acknowledge the danger. They ignored their own engineers, overrode safety protocols, and insisted that the experiment must continue. The result? An explosion that released 400 times more radiation than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, poisoning entire cities and leaving a permanent scar on human history. This was not just a technological failure, it was a failure of human judgment. It was the result of power blinding people to reality. Psychologists have studied why power makes people more prone to stupidity. The results are alarming. 1. Power makes people overconfident. Studies show that the more power a person has, the more they overestimate their own intelligence and abilities. 2. Power reduces empathy. Leaders in high positions often become disconnected from the struggles of ordinary people, making them less likely to consider alternative viewpoints. 3. Power encourages recklessness. When people feel untouchable, they take greater risks, often without considering the consequences. Can this cycle be broken? Is there a way to prevent power from leading to stupidity? The only solution is constant self-reflection and intellectual humility. The most effective leaders in history have been those who surround themselves with people who challenge them, not just agree with them. Remain open to criticism and willing to admit when they are wrong. Stay connected to the reality of the people they lead. Unfortunately, these traits are rare. Most people, once they gain power, refuse to question themselves. And that is why stupidity continues to thrive at the highest levels of society. This is why Bonhoeffer's warning remains more relevant than ever. A society that places blind faith in its leaders without holding them accountable is doomed to repeat history's greatest mistakes. Stupidity is not just an individual failing, it is a contagious social force. It spreads through society like an epidemic, infecting people who would otherwise think rationally. And in today's world, where misinformation travels faster than ever, stupidity has become more dangerous than at any point in history. How misinformation spreads faster than facts. In the past, ignorance spread through word of mouth, religious dogma, or state-controlled propaganda. But today, stupidity has a new vehicle: social media. Studies have shown that false information spreads 6 times faster than factual information. Why? Because lies are often more exciting, shocking, and emotionally charged than the truth. People don't share information because it's accurate, they share it because it confirms their beliefs, fuels their emotions, or makes them feel part of a group. And once misinformation spreads, it's nearly impossible to correct. People don't want to believe they were wrong. Instead of admitting their mistake, they double down, reinforcing stupidity even further. The power of viral conspiracy theories. History is filled with conspiracy theories that people blindly accepted, no matter how absurd, from flat earth theories to denial of scientific evidence. Stupidity thrives when people reject critical thinking in favor of easy explanations. Take, for example, the anti-vaccine movement. Despite overwhelming scientific evidence proving the effectiveness and safety of vaccines, millions of people around the world believe they are dangerous. This belief didn't spread because of facts, it spread because of fear, social pressure, and misinformation campaigns. The same pattern repeats throughout history. The more people accept a false belief, the harder it becomes to challenge it. And before long, entire societies can be driven by stupidity, making irrational decisions that harm not just individuals, but entire nations. Propaganda: how masses are tricked into ignoring reality. Dictators and authoritarian regimes have always relied on stupidity to maintain control. The Nazi regime, for example, used propaganda to convince an entire population to ignore reality. Hitler's government controlled the media, spread false narratives, and labeled all dissenting voices as enemies of the state. The result? Millions of ordinary Germans accepted horrific policies not because they were evil, but because they stopped questioning. This is what philosopher Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil, the idea that history's greatest atrocities were not carried out by monsters, but by normal people who simply followed orders without thinking. And this pattern is not limited to history. Even today, propaganda shapes political beliefs, fuels division, and makes people blindly follow leaders without questioning their actions. The only cure: thinking for yourself. Bonhoeffer's warning is clear: stupidity spreads when people stop thinking critically. The only way to break the cycle is to constantly question what we are told, challenge popular opinions, and seek truth even when it is uncomfortable. Because if we don't, then history will repeat itself again and again. If stupidity is so deeply embedded in society, spreading through misinformation, reinforced by power, and fueled by blind obedience, is there any way to escape it? Or are we doomed to repeat history, making the same mistakes over and over again? Dietrich Bonhoeffer believed that stupidity was not just an intellectual failure, it was a moral failure. People choose stupidity not because they lack intelligence, but because it is easier. It is easier to follow the crowd than to think for yourself. It is easier to obey than to question. It is easier to believe comfortable lies than to face uncomfortable truths. But while stupidity is powerful, it is not inevitable. There is a way to resist it. Bonhoeffer believed that breaking free from stupidity required conscious effort, a deliberate choice to think critically, challenge authority, and expose yourself to uncomfortable ideas. The first step to escaping stupidity is to train your mind to question information instead of blindly accepting it. This doesn't mean doubting everything, it means thinking actively, analyzing evidence, and recognizing logical fallacies. Ask why more often. Instead of accepting information at face value, ask yourself, who benefits from me believing this? Is there actual evidence for this claim? Does this make logical sense, or am I just believing it because others do? Look for contradictions. If something is true, it should hold up under scrutiny. If a belief requires ignoring inconvenient facts, it's time to question it. Resist emotional manipulation. Propaganda, fake news, and conspiracy theories often work by triggering emotions like fear, anger, or loyalty. Learn to recognize when emotions are being used to control your thinking. Stupidity thrives when people stop thinking for themselves. The more you train your mind to ask questions, the more resistant you become to falling into the trap of blind belief. One of the main reasons stupidity spreads so easily is that people only listen to voices that confirm their beliefs. This is called an echo chamber, a closed space where only one perspective is repeated, and all opposing views are ignored or attacked. Read opposing views. If you're only consuming information that aligns with your existing beliefs, you are not learning, you are reinforcing your own ignorance. Challenge yourself by reading different perspectives. Surround yourself with thinkers, not followers. Engage in conversations with people who challenge your views rather than just agreeing with you. A smart person welcomes debate, a stupid person avoids it. Social media detox. Algorithms are designed to feed you information that aligns with your past interactions. Break free from the cycle by actively seeking different sources. When you only hear one side of the story, you are not thinking, you are repeating. And repetition without thought is the foundation of stupidity. One of Bonhoeffer's most haunting realizations was that stupid people do not see themselves as responsible for their actions. They obey orders, follow social norms, and justify their behavior by saying, "I was just doing what I was told." This is how the greatest atrocities in history have happened, not because of evil geniuses, but because of ordinary people who refuse to question authority. Authority should always be questioned. Being in a position of power does not make someone right. Whether it's a politician, a CEO, or a religious leader, their words should be tested against logic and evidence. Do not confuse compliance with morality. Just because everyone else is doing something does not mean it is right. History is full of people who followed the crowd into disaster. Take responsibility for your own beliefs and actions. If you believe something, make sure it is because you have thought about it critically, not because someone told you to believe it. Real intelligence is not about knowing more facts than others, it is about having the courage to think independently. The next time you hear a popular opinion, a trending news story, or a political argument, pause before agreeing, before repeating, before reacting. Ask yourself, am I thinking for myself, or am I just following the crowd? Stupidity thrives when people give up their ability to think. The only way to defeat it is to reclaim that power, to ask, to question, to challenge, and to never stop learning. Because in the end, the choice is yours. Will you think, or will you be controlled? History's greatest tragedies were not just caused by evil men with sinister plans. They were caused by ordinary people who refused to think, people who followed orders without question, who accepted lies without resistance, who remained silent when they should have spoken. We like to believe that if we had lived in those times, if we had been in Nazi Germany or during the rise of totalitarian regimes, we would have seen through the lies. We would have resisted. We would have stood for truth. But would we? Or would we, like so many before us, go along with the crowd, accept what we are told, and let history repeat itself? Stupidity is not just a problem of the past, it's happening now. Bonhoeffer's warning was not just about history, it was about the present. It was about us. Look around, people today still believe in absurd conspiracy theories, blindly follow political leaders without question, and reject evidence when it contradicts their personal beliefs. Entire societies are being shaped by propaganda, misinformation, and social pressure to conform. The tools may have changed, it's no longer mass rallies and government-controlled newspapers, but social media algorithms and viral headlines, but the result is the same. People are thinking less and obeying more. And the terrifying truth? The more stupidity spreads, the harder it becomes to resist. The most dangerous people in history weren't evil, they were just too stupid to know better. Think about the worst crimes in history, genocides, wars, oppressive regimes. They were not carried out by monsters alone. They were carried out by regular people who believed they were doing the right thing, by men and women who never paused to ask, am I being manipulated? Am I blindly following orders? Am I contributing to something terrible? This is why Bonhoeffer feared stupidity more than evil. Because evil requires intention, but stupidity requires nothing. It does not plot, scheme, or plan destruction, it simply follows unquestioningly until it becomes a force that cannot be stopped. The only way to escape the trap of stupidity? If stupidity is the greatest danger to society, then the most important thing you can do, the most powerful act of resistance, is to think. Think before you believe. Think before you repeat. Think before you follow. Because the moment you stop thinking for yourself, someone else will do it for you. A final challenge, will you be a thinker or a follower? The next time you come across a popular opinion, a viral news story, or a widely accepted belief, pause. Ask yourself, who benefits from me believing this? Am I just accepting what I've been told, or have I actually thought about it? Am I being a thinker, or am I just another follower? Because stupidity does not announce itself. It does not tell you when it has taken hold of your mind. It does not say, "You are one of the blind followers now." It simply spreads quietly until one day you wake up and realize history has repeated itself once again. If you want to escape the trap of stupidity, subscribe. We explore the hidden forces shaping human psychology, the biases, the thought traps, and the unseen influences that shape our beliefs and decisions. If you want to learn how to think for yourself in a world that encourages blind obedience, subscribe, because the only way to resist stupidity is to never stop questioning.